Hi, my name is Patricia Moore-Martinez. I'm from Temple University. I am the Associate Chair of the Spanish Department there, and I'm actually going to be coming at this from a really different angle. I'm going to be talking about the technologies that I used, mostly unsuccessfully, to further my own pedagogy in my internship course. I've been teaching an internship course, service learning, experiential learning. It's morphed through a lot of names over the past 10 years at Temple for about the last 10 or 11 years. My students work in the community, and we meet once a week in order for them to really work through what they're doing and what this means. Inadvertently, it's become globalized this past year. In the fall, I had a student who was doing her internship in Ecuador, and in the spring, I had a student who was doing her internship in Spain. In the past, I've had students who have done internship programs. They've been in Guatemala for 3 weeks, but they've been on campus for my class. So I've always essentially had a group of students that I could work with, and what I believe about what I'm doing in my internship class is very much tied to the pedagogy of how I teach that. So what I was working through, that depth, was how do I keep them going deep, even though they're very far away, the breadth. All of a sudden we're adding Ecuador and Spain, and for a little while New Mexico, some flexibility to these students who are not on campus with us, and being able to make them connect to the students who are on campus. And as I said, unlike you asking me questions of what I did, at the end I'm going to be like, so, suggestions, because I'm really open to better ideas. So what makes an internship valuable, I think, again, is just the fundamental basis of my pedagogy. It's understanding what you're doing and understanding all of the academic input you've had along the way to really contextualize this. We talk a lot about critical thinking, we talk about making those connections, but I don't think we always do a really great job at it. And so my goal was synthesize the theoretical with the experiential. For my particular students, that means they may have had some introduction to linguistics, sociolinguistics. They have had some introduction to literature. They've been learning all sorts of rules about Spanish and grammar and subjunctive. They may have education courses and talked about bilingual education, and they've all formed opinions. Now they're out in the community, and they're going to find everything they learned is sort of true and often not really true, and they're going to have much more nuanced understandings of all of this. And for them to work through that, I feel it's really important that we address what they thought was happening, and then we look at what's happening. And as you can imagine, that takes a lot of discussion. What they want to do is a little different than what I want to do, so we also have to meet that. They just want to speak Spanish, which is great. I mean, I'm a Spanish teacher. I'm completely in favor of speaking Spanish. They want to add it to the resume. I don't know about your institutions, but it's very much the zeitgeist that you cannot graduate from college without an internship. They don't know what that means. They're just like, okay, I need this on my resume. And I'm like, well, if you're sitting here, and I work with nonprofits, occasionally for-profits, but mostly not. What does this mean? What do you add to the resume? Do you say, I watch them be disorganized, or I understand the little bit of resources that these people are making magic happen with? So for me, I am so okay with adding that to their resume, but I want them to know what they learned. And for the most part, students in my class want to help people. They're not getting paid, as we've already discussed. They are paying for the class, it's part of that. And they're often paying to take public transportation to locations that, to be honest, aren't necessarily where they want to hang out with afterwards, depending on where they're located. So my other goal is to make them understand. In my class, we speak Spanish, so I have that covered. We're done there. But in their sites, they may or may not be speaking Spanish, and they need to understand why that's happening and why they're still learning. So this is just sort of a little map of who my students are and where they are. So I sometimes have heritage speakers. They may have grown up hearing Spanish, maybe speaking Spanish. Often these students are very reluctant to speak Spanish outside of the classroom because there's a little bit of shame involved with it. They're not speaking like their grandparents, so they understand, but they'll answer in English. There's a great variety in how these students' attitude toward language manifests. I've had native speakers. I've had at least 4 or 5 students who, one of them had a BA from Chile, but they still want to be here. And then I have our second language learners. All of their Spanish is valid, all of their Spanish is important, all of them can learn from each other. And they need to know that when they go out in the community, None of them have the right Spanish, but they all have the ability to communicate, or what I'm helping them do is get that ability to communicate. I know this is a lot of y'all. I promise we're going to get into that. So you can see they're in educational programs, they're food pantries. I've had one student, a second language learner who was, I don't know how many of you are language people, but not intermediate high, who was actually a reporter for the newspaper, and she ended up writing some articles in Spanish because that's what they needed her to do. The Panamanian Consul, health clinics, Congreso is it's a large umbrella institution for social services in Philly. And as I mentioned, I had a student in Spain this past semester, Ecuador in the fall semester, and for about half the semester I had a student who was in New Mexico during her internship there. She lived there. And then obviously my students in Philadelphia. So what, I'm giving you a little bit more background than you possibly need. But, and thank you to Rowan for talking about reflection. I think reflection is critical to understanding an internship. Every single day you come back from that internship, I don't want to hear, oh, I just photocopied. I want to hear, what did you do? Who did you interact with? What were you photocopying? Were you photocopying things that were in English for Spanish speakers? Like, there's lots of stuff you can unpack here. So I use Kolb's theory, which is knowledge is created through the transformation of the experience. I think, and I fundamentally believe, that a lot of this can take place individually. You can give students prompts and essays, blogs, and you can work through this. I think it's richer in a conversational, often richer in a conversational setting, but I do believe that this can be done individually with guided, with structured input. But I don't believe that some of my other course goals can be achieved without synchronous interaction. So up here I have Amber Crombie. She was a psychologist in the 60s in England. She did this really seminal study on what conversation, what discussion groups could do with medical students and how much better they were able to diagnose patients. Since then, her studies have been replicated about the value of discussion. And so these are some of the things that she found that discussion-based classes could do if they're structured correctly. Problem solving, application of concepts, discrimination between fact and fiction. All of those align very nicely with my actual course goals and my outcomes. So explain what language policies are, how diverse groups are affected. Most students don't know what a language policy is. They don't know that we don't have an official language in the United States. They don't know what that would mean. Their default thing is, oh, my class, we should have English and Spanish. And we start talking through what that looks like. They start to think of new ways to work through giving people access to resources, perhaps without suddenly making Spanish an official language, which involves, as you can imagine, all sorts of resources and political decisions and polemics, etc. Application of concepts within and outside of one's own experience. And so they go in, I speak Spanish like this. That person won't speak to me in Spanish. What's wrong with me? Is it my problem? So we start looking at how complex identity is related to people's language choices, how people use different languages in different situations with different people, how you can affect that, and how you understand that. And instead of thinking, oh, they don't want to speak Spanish to me, or my Spanish isn't good enough, they start to observe other people, the nuances of what language looks like. And I've had, this often works especially well for my heritage speakers who often have very uncomfortable with their language use. But it's through these conversations with other students that they get, this isn't just happening to me. You've had a different experience, and I understand your experience through the filter of what we're talking about in class. And discrimination between fact and fiction. This is hugely important to me because they are all at one site, and they will think, I have met these 3 people from Guatemala, therefore, this is it. Like, I know it all now. So in these conversations that we have, for example, if we're talking about immigration, that's one of the topics, they'll find, other students will say, no, when I was working with my clients or when I was working with the population that I was engaged with, they said this. All of this comes out through structured discussion. Adding Spain and Ecuador was challenging for me. It wasn't my original plan. Like, I didn't say, oh, let me find a student who's like doing an internship in another country so I can add this. It happened that way. But once we brought them in, it was really clear how difficult this was. those students who were in other countries prefaced almost everything they said with, yeah, I'm not sure if this is relevant, you're talking about Spanish in the US. And I got to follow up and say, in this group of 3, talk about maybe how we can better understand this. And suddenly we were entering into indigenous languages, we were talking to socioeconomic status, we were entering into a lot of different realms. So I actually really appreciated having students, especially so diverse, Ecuadorians, from really wildly different cultural settings in the class, because I found that both the students abroad and the students in the US really began to parse apart what I was trying to say. So that's, as you can imagine, since this discussion thing is really important to me, anybody want to guess what my problem is? It's not too hard.
Having a synchronous discussion.
Having a synchronous discussion. So this is my student in Spain on my laptop. She came to my class every week on my laptop. Up there in the corner is, we were talking about bilingual education and reading, it doesn't matter. So I usually gave them about 10 or 15 minutes of input. By nature, I'm an interactive professor, so I tend to show some information, I ask a question, I go discussion. It's like boom, 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 back and forth. Both of my students, Sarah in Spain and Isabel in Ecuador, were champs. You know what I mean? They were really down with us. But we were struggling to keep them included in this, not struggling to keep them included in the discussion. They were fine with that. The technology, which seems like it should be here, and again, if you guys have any ideas, I'm really open to it, wasn't here for what I needed to do. So my Band-Aid solution was Sarah's on FaceTime with me, because we both were able to go on FaceTime. And this is everything I tried. So in the fall semester, my student in Ecuador, it was a last minute decision. I'm like, yes, I can make this work. She's like, can I just take the course online? And as you've just seen my goals, that was not going to fly. I was like, no, we're going to make this happen. Can you log on every Tuesday from 11 to 12:30? And she looked at her schedule, her work, and she's like, I can do that 12 out of 15 Tuesdays. And I said, great. So we templed our interface, our email hooks up to Google Hangout. We had no problem with that. Because I wasn't expecting this to happen, I didn't really try to handle it any better. So she would log on, and for about half the class, I had a student in New Mexico who's doing it. She had to drop the class for family reasons. So the 2 of them would be in Google Hangout, and I would carry my laptop. I'm going to lose you. And I would be like, you 2 talk to Isabel and Dolores. Okay, we're going to switch groups. And my class, and it's a small class, it's capped to 10, they were champs. Everyone was very involved and attentive to my virtual students. When I was presenting, they could kind of hear. I would send them my PowerPoints ahead of time so they could follow along. They lost all of the interactivity. It was just too difficult to flip back and forth. But for the most part, they both felt like they got a lot out of it. The student from New Mexico, which I thought was interesting, she stopped doing all the coursework around week 3. She kept coming to class until about week 8. So she actually enjoyed when she finally dropped. She's like, yes, I felt like I was learning something when I was in class. And it's like, good, I'm glad. Google Hangout was not my perfect solution. I wanted to be able to separate my virtual students. I wanted them to hear better what I was saying in my PowerPoints, and I wanted them to be, they were losing probably about 30% of the class just through sound issues, just through the inadequacy of Google Hangout. So our VMP virtual meeting place is WebEx by Cisco. I had been hesitant to use it in the fall semester. Every single meeting I've ever been in, we are going to WebEx somebody in, and it never works, and someone whips out their iPhone, and that's how we get the person. So I'm like, if this isn't working in meetings, it's not going to work for my class. But I preemptively applied for an ed tech fellow, thinking, all right, I have this situation again. It's going to keep coming up. Let me resolve it. So an ed tech fellow is a junior or senior undergraduate student who works closely with our Teaching and Learning Center to facilitate faculty technological needs. Explained to them at the beginning what I wanted. Nobody understood, and I was like, come to class, watch how I teach. I think it'll be really clear. Came to class, watched how I taught, went back to her mentor, who said WebEx. It's definitely WebEx. Once they're on WebEx, you will be able to like turn off the sound when I'm speaking, so there's no bzzz or feedback sound, and we'll turn on the sound when they're in small groups, et cetera, et cetera. It never worked. WebEx is a huge amount of bandwidth. She's in Spain and her host family's home. Every now and then she got on. I think by the third week, I just sent her my cell phone and she would text me, trying to get on. And that's where we went to FaceTime, which of all these three had the highest quality. We were able to, we never lost connection. We never dropped her. When she did her final presentation to the rest of the class, she was on my laptop and the whole class gathered around. Again, you know, a group of 7 people, 8 people, and watched her. But the only way she could participate in the PowerPoints was one of my other students would literally lift my laptop and carry it somewhere where she could see the screen and she could hear adequately. And so I foresee that this will continue to happen. I want it to happen. I think the pedagogy, I think the learning was really deeper. I think we got a lot out of having these students come from other places. I don't foresee ever going into a completely online class voluntarily. Explain in a second. Although I've been told it's easier to create breakout rooms, there's all sorts of ways that I can create these discussions with an online thing. Because I've also found that when students are in my class, those 15 minutes after class of I'm having this problem in my internship, there's a lot of really important interactions that take place face to face. And as I said, the mere fact that my one student from New Mexico continued to come to class after she stopped her internship and doing her classwork, I thought was really telling about how important that connection and synchronous interactivity was. So, their report. Both of my external students said they were afraid I wasn't going to include them, and they would do it again in spite of the text messages the last 5 minutes at the beginning of the class, in spite of probably sitting there for, as I said, 20 to 30% of the class literally not hearing. And again, small class, 9 people, they could just be really nice to me. But I never had a problem with them not coming or not being there on time. They were very attentive. In my student evaluations from my on-campus students, I would say probably 60% of them addressed the situation, and they all said something along the lines of, it was very cool to have these students in other countries. I felt really bad for Professor Moore-Martinez trying to figure this out every week. They all expressed sympathy for me. I, again, thought that was very sweet of them. I was really frustrated that I work in, a research one institution in a major city, and I was not able to fix this. So what did I think? I think I should be able to make this happen. I think I want to be able to make it happen. I think there have to be resources out there to make it happen. I did reach out to other units in Temple about technology, and the response was, well, you can go into a room where it'll be a bigger screen, and essentially a room that would allow me to record everything. They're like, and then they could play back the recording. I'm like, but they're still not talking. Nobody really understood what I was trying to do. There was a possibility that if I could write something up, maybe they would buy me iPads. So I'm all about writing something up and getting iPads. But that doesn't solve the problem of how do I get these students both in the presentation form and in the discussion. Carrying iPads around with people logged on differently would work, but I can't have 7 FaceTime accounts. That would be insane. And probably, impossible. I don't know, I'm sure Apple would let me do it. But I don't have 7 Facebook accounts. So I am actually teaching this class online this summer. Not my decision, not voluntarily. And the way I'm handling this is the first week I had a PowerPoint which students had to respond to questions afterwards, which I spoke through. After reading their answers, I thought, okay, we got to level 1 of what I wanted them to do, but all of those sort of stereotypes or not quite nuanced responses, I can't address immediately. I can write you feedback. Will they read it? Maybe. Will they not read it? Maybe. But the things that I can hear in the classroom and I can say, hey, let's unpack that, I can't do. this past week, I made an interactive voice thread where after every 4 or 5 slides, I ask the question, and one student answers, another student responds. I have found it's slightly richer, but at the same time, there is this element of we're dealing with sensitive subjects. We're talking about pan-ethnicity. We're talking about people's identities. We're talking about things that I really want us to delve into deeply, and I'm not getting there this way. I'm not giving up yet. The way our summer online courses are structured, we were not allowed to add a synchronous component. So that's, if you ask, that's why it's not there. I think I will demand it in the future if possible. And Temple will be starting Zoom, which I believe there's a session later this afternoon. I haven't used it yet because my ed tech fellow, every time I asked, she's like, no, you can't do it. And I later found out I could have because it's free. Yeah, my bad. It was my bad. Like, I did not look into it further.